You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Hello, cyclothids, and welcome back to the show. I am so excited to share our new season with you, and we're starting it off today with a really awesome guest who I am so excited about having on, and the interview that we did together was really incredible, so I'm very excited to share that with you. But I also want to let you know, after the interview, we have a new segment that we've added to the show, which is called Knowledge Checks. You may have seen on Instagram, or you may have heard us talk about it at the end of last season, but knowledge checks are going to be a short review of the literature that exists around the topic of the week. So for today, while we're talking about world building, our knowledge check will be something to do with the literature that exists on world building. And in case you didn't know, I'm Robert Walker, author of Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system. And this is my show, where I teach collaborative storytellers how to create memorable campaigns using psychology. So what does it mean to build a world? Especially in the role-playing space, this means creating the foundations that all these games are going to take place in. They can be small, just the setting for a single game, or they can be very large, a whole world in which many of your campaigns will take place. The guest that we have today probably needs no introduction, as his name is practically synonymous with role-playing games, but it would be a disservice to this legend not to mention some of the incredible things that he's done. His early work with Iron Crown Enterprises, he created Dark Space and worked for TSR, writing and designing games and modules, including Labyrinth of Madness, A Paladin in Hell, the Planeswalker's Handbook, and designing the conspiracy game Dark Matter. He was then a senior designer for Wizards of the Coast, contributing to the 3rd edition titles, The Player's Handbook, The Dungeons Master's Guide, The Monster Manual. He did the adventure Return to the Temple of Elemental Evils, one of my all-time favorites, and the D20 system Call of Cthulhu. He then started Malhavoc Press, where he created Arcana Unearthed, which was some variant PHB work, and a full setting based on his homebrew campaign, Tullus. Then in 2012, with Shauna Germain, he founded Monte Games, where they produced Numenera, The Strange, the Cipher System Rulebook, Invisible Sun, and No Thank You Evil. And what's more, all of this are just the highlights of a very prolific career. So with that, let's get to the interview. Hello and welcome to the show. I am so thankful and grateful to be joined today by the one and only, the legendary Monte Cook. Welcome to my show, Monte.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be here.
So you have a long and illustrious career as a world builder. Your name is sort of synonymous with Dungeons and Dragons and world creation and basically everything TTRPG centered. Like, you're one of the most recognizable names in the industry. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you to be one of the most recognizable names? How did you get to this point?
Well, so I started writing role-playing games and role-playing games material professionally when I was still in college, and I did a lot of work for a company called Iron Crown Enterprises for Rollmaster and Champions and a lot of things. But in '94, I started working at TSR, and that's probably where a lot of the work that I have done that people are probably more familiar with. That was, I started working on Planescape and a lot of core D&D stuff. And then when TSR got bought out by Wizards of the Coast, we started working on 3rd edition D&D, and I was one of the designers on that team, along with a bunch of really great people, Skip Williams, Jonathan Tweet. And That's probably what people even to this day still kind of
Mm,
remember me for, is working on third edition, 3.5,
mhm.
whatever you want to call it. And but since then, I have done a lot of follow-up stuff for D&D. I had a little design studio called Malhavik Press,
Mhm.
that did a bunch of D20 compatible stuff. And then now I have another company, Monte Games, where we do mostly non D&D stuff. Although we have dabbled in some 5e compatible supplements, but we've done a lot of our own stuff. Numenera, The Strange, Invisible Sun, a lot of different kinds of RPGs.
Yeah, so you started Monte Cook Games in 2012 with your partner Shauna Germain,
Mm-hmm.
and that was kind of, from what I've heard you speak about in the past, this was something that sort of came to be because of you had one of the most successful Kickstarters up to that point in time.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about that process? Like what went through your mind when you published this Kickstarter and then all of a sudden you're breaking all these records and now all of a sudden it's like, okay, the world is sort of open to us. What do we want to do with it?
It was a very strange time, to be completely honest. I had this idea. I wanted to put out a game, Numenera. I thought, I had very modest expectations. Kickstarter was still quite new at that point, and really, I just kind of wanted to give it a try just to see what that was
Mhm.
like. And it really exploded and funded not just the game, but a whole line of supplements that I knew that we would need help putting together. And it basically, in a conversation that I had with Shauna, it was basically, we had the make or break point where we're like, okay, are we going to become a company, or are we just going to put these things out, get them done,
Yeah.
and then move on and do something else? And we decided, let's give it a go. And we hired the former brand manager of D&D, Charles Ryan,
Mhm.
and hired game designer Bruce Cordell, who's awesome. And we put together a great team. And now it's 10 years later, and we're still going strong. So I think we made the right decision.
I think you did too. I mean, I'm looking at my bookshelf over here, and I think I've got at least 10 books that have your name printed on the side of it over there. So it's just kind of fascinating to see this illustrious career and how much you've done with it.
Thanks.
When it comes to starting the process of creating a new world or creating a new setting, when do you decide when you're going to start something new or when you're going to tackle a big project like that? Where do you begin? Like, what's the initial starting point for that?
Well, I've probably done it in different ways. I would say after lots of different tries and whatnot, I think the best place to start is actually with the characters. And by that, I don't mean the specific individuals, but thinking about who the characters are going to be and what they're going to do in this world.
Mm,
With something like Talus, which was a big D&D compatible world that I started with, but
mhm,
it's all city based, and there's dungeons, but the dungeons are beneath the city. I knew that, okay, the player characters are obviously going to be adventurers, and we're familiar with that, but here they're going to be clearly urban based,
mhm.
and they're never going to leave this city, right? The whole campaign is going to be in this
Right.
city. But then for something like Numenera, which is totally different, far, far future, technology is sort of like magic in that
Right.
nobody totally understands it. I knew that there were going to be all these ancient ruins filled with weird treasures. I knew that the players were going to be people who go into these ruins, right, and
Mhm.
who explore them and bring this stuff back out and figure out how it works and make the world a better place, because now we have these cool things from the past. And so it's who the players are going to be, and then that shapes the world, right? I knew the kinds of characters that I want to make in various games, and kind of design a world that works for that, right?
You brought up Tolos, which is a game we've run several campaigns in that setting. It's one
Cool.
that we really enjoy. In fact, we just got done running like a year and a half long one, and we spent a lot of time in the Bane Warrens and doing all that stuff. I've noticed as we've played in some of your worlds that you sort of leave a lot of things lying around for game masters to pick up on and utilize. Specifically in Tolos, I'm thinking the Iron Mage or the claims to the Imperial Throne, where there's these three different entities that are staking a claim. Do you include these just for the fostering of creativity for dungeon masters? Or when you write that stuff, do you already have someone in mind? Like, do you know the identity of the Iron Mage? Is that something that will be revealed at some point?
So the answer is that, so because Talos was my campaign, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's I ran that for my own players, and then it became a supplement. In my campaign, when I was the dungeon master, I knew the answers to those questions, and I had ideas for who was going to take the throne and whatnot. But I think it's important for a game group to take on their own sort of, once you buy a supplement, it's yours and becomes your
Mm-hmm.
world. And so what I want to do is, I don't want to give you a lot of answers. I want to give you a bunch of questions that you then answer.
Yeah.
And because you're going to answer them the way you want to answer them, and if you've got a great idea, maybe your idea is better than mine, right?
Yeah.
I want people to sort of feel ownership. I mean, since Talos came out, what it was 2006 or whatever, I've had many different people come up to me and say, well, in my game, the Iron Mage is secretly this person, right? And that's great, because it tells me that they've made the campaign their own, and that's what you should do, right? As a game designer, I'm not a storyteller. I'm the person who empowers the actual storytellers, which are the people actually at the table.
I think one way that you really do empower storytelling, I talk about this in my book, is the idea of making your stories cinematic. Your rule sets, with the Cypher system rule set that you built, you include tools that are built to make things more cinematic, like, for example, the GM intrusion that you use, or the ability for characters to expend extra effort when they're really trying to accomplish a goal. How important to you is the idea of making something cinematic or very dramatic? How much does that lend to a story? And can you talk about why you decided to include those sort of things?
Well, I think that making things cinematic is a very good option for many kinds of games. I don't think it necessarily works for every game. Like, there are people out there who want to play something that's sort of very harsh survival kind of thing, or whatever, right? And where you're sort of counting every copper piece, and that's fine too. But for me, I am, as it turns out, an avid film lover, and
Hmm.
right. And so now I can't really even watch a movie without thinking, oh, the rope that they're climbing is starting to fray. Oh, that's a GM intrusion. Right.
Yeah.
These things that, because what cinematic really means is understanding sort of the raising of tension,
Hmm.
and as that tension increases, things get more exciting, things get more intense, obviously, right? Hence the word. And so I wanted tools so that the GM could increase that tension without just breaking the rule, right? I mean, the GM can do whatever they want, but I wanted it to put it right there in the book, right? You can make the rope that they're climbing start to fray, right? And here's how
Hmm.
you do it. And not because you want to screw them over, but because you want to make things more intense. And then conversely, you've got to give the players a way to react to that. And that's what effort is in the Cypher system, right? You're like, okay, things are getting really, really tough now. I've got to use more effort. And that's a limited resource, but I'm,
Hmm.
got to use it now, or we're going to fail. It's kind of like a proliferation of an arms race a little bit, right? The GM's
Hmm.
making things tougher, the players are putting in more effort, and it goes up and up and up till you get to the top, and then hopefully you have this huge cinematic conclusion with some dramatic scenes, and hopefully some lucky dice rolls, and you get a great finish. I mean, the goal, I think, of every sort of designer, whether you're writing an adventure or a game system or whatever, right? The goal is so that when it's done, when the session is over, or right at the end of the big campaign or whatever, you've got everyone super excited and maybe they're even on their feet. Yay, they're all cheering because
Yeah.
of, they finally defeated the big bad guy or whatever. That's what you want. And that's what cinematic gaming is all about, really.
It gives you that total immersion, whether it's in action scene or even in emotional scenes. I think it's also incredibly important too to have those immersive moments where you just sort of lose yourself in the character, lose yourself in the story, and just become one with what's taking place. You kind of forget where you are in the real world for a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It's one of the reasons that I really like horror gaming, right?
Yeah,
Because, it's one thing to make the player character scared. It's another to make the players scared.
yeah,
And,
I agree.
it becomes very visceral and very, like you said, emotional.
I've talked about it for years with people I've gamed with, but one of my favorite adventures of all time is actually one that you did, which was the Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil. And I love that gritty, dark sort of fantasy. I think there's just something more visceral about connecting to something that frightens you and being able to overcome something that frightens you.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm sure this has come out in a lot of my writing, right? But I want the people that you're going up against to be really awful, right?
Yeah,
To
yeah.
be really scary, and you're really happy when they're defeated or dead.
Well, I've definitely built characters out of the Book of Isle Darkness, which was another one that you were a
Right.
part of, and I think that's an excellent tool for just kind of exploring the different ways in which people can be evil, not just necessarily like, oh, they killed a lot of people, but sort of more of that psychological aspect of it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you DM or when you game, do you have a preference between worlds that are more sandboxy in nature, or do you like adventures that are more railroady? Do you kind of have a mix between, and is there a reason why?
I suppose a bit of a mix, but I like very open-ended things. I enjoy sometimes putting a challenge in front of the players that I don't actually know how they're going to overcome. Not
Yeah,
because I'm trying to, you know, screw them over, but because I know they're going to come up with some kind of plan. They're going to, pull out something that I forgot about, or come up with some amazing new creative solution, and that's fun for me, right? That means that
yeah,
not everything is scripted for me, that I get some surprises too. And plus, I will add in this, that there is nothing better, I think, from a game master point of view, than to have really proactive players, right?
yeah. I
Rather
agree.
than following along on a sort of path that they're given, a railroad that they're given. When the players decide, no, we want to do this, we want to go to this place and accomplish this thing, because now, as a game master, that they're doing what they want, right? Because they are the ones that decided it, right? You didn't give them a quest.
Hmm.
They figured out what they wanted to do in this world, and that's really cool. And I think that it's really fun it kind of turns the tables a little bit, where the GM is always kind of reacting to the players as opposed to the
Right.
other way around.
One of the things that I've noticed in my games that I've run, I often come to the table with an idea or a concept of how I want a situation to be handled or how I want a story to go. But if you listen as a dungeon master to the ideas that your players have or their speculations about what you're plotting for them, sometimes they give you ideas that are just so much better than what you have thought of on your own. And I just think it's that, two heads are better than one, and sometimes just those creative juices flowing around the table, if you're not listening, you can sort of miss those sometimes. But I think that's just such an important skill as a DM, is to pay attention to what your characters are expecting and what they're wanting.
I think you're 100% right. I mean, I think it's always important to remember that it's group storytelling, right? Everyone is
Hmm.
contributing and participating in the story. It's not just the GM kind of telling the players a story.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. So let me ask you this next question. It's a two-part question. It's about getting your worlds that you've created out there. So first, in your long career in publishing, how has it changed publishing content in the TTRPG space? And secondly, is there a route you would recommend to somebody to try and get their work published the first time?
It has changed so dramatically. I almost don't even know where to start. When I started, the first thing that I started my first writing assignment in late 1988, and at that point, it was next to impossible to get content published that wasn't through an existing publisher. Right? You could work as a designer for a company, whether that be a small company or TSR, or you could, try to get published in Dragon magazine. That was it. That was your opportunity. And now, with all of the tools available to people, you know, I hate to say it this way because it sounds dismissive, and I don't mean it to, but I mean anybody can put together
Yeah.
a supplement. And in fact, you go to the program that Wizards of the Coast has on Drive Through RPG,
Yeah.
the DM's Guild, yeah, and Monte Games has a very similar program for the Cypher system, and on Drive Through as well. And you can put together a thing, you can put it out there. Next thing you know, you're making a little bit of money based on the cool dungeon or the cool set of new rules that you came up with, and that's great. I think it is such an influx of creativity and kind of an end run around what used to be a totally gatekeeper system, right? Where
Yeah.
you had to get through, and there weren't that many companies, right? So there was probably a dozen people on the planet that were deciding what got to be a game supplement and what didn't. And now there's absolutely no
Right.
gatekeeping.
How much do you think that has enriched the community of role play and made it more accessible? Do you think that's a part of why it's become so mainstream now?
I think so. I think that it's very difficult to argue that, and this goes back to, I think, the D20 license and the open gaming license,
Yeah.
which started back in 2000, where people are just empowered to get out there and do their own stuff, specifically in that case, for D&D or for D&D like things. And I think that, as I said, that infusion of creativity, it's like what we were saying before about, two heads are better than one, right? The more
Yeah.
people you sort of have involved in helping create a cool story, or in this case, a cool, game, the better it's going to be. And I have no doubt that these third-party supplements, these extra things that people are putting out, whether it be on DM's Guild or through their own sources at all, or resources at all, has made role-playing games better, both D&D and more independent games, and just the proliferation of small indie games where there are games out there that are about topics that are 20, 30 years ago we would never have thought that there would be a
Right.
role-playing game about ordering food at a restaurant, but now there is one,
It's
right?
true. Like, yeah, I know there was one I was listening to over Halloween that the whole thing was just trying to get to the other side of like a cornfield, and like this is like a one session D&D thing, but there's so many options and there's just so many creative ideas out there. I mean, it's amazing. It's like a never ending supply of imagination and creativity that's at your fingertips now, and I think it has changed role playing so much and so much for the better. And I also think that the fact that there are so many more hands and so many more people involved in the creation process, there's been a lot of positive changes in getting new people involved in the game that maybe weren't represented in it before. Can you speak a little bit to what you've seen in that in the last few years?
That is definitely the case, and I think it has really enriched the whole game community in general. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but when I started, like everyone who was in gaming was male and white,
Yep.
right? I mean, the exceptions were so rare that you hardly even knew about them,
Right.
and now that is really really changing, and we're hearing not just so many different voices, but so many different voices with different perspectives and different ideas and whatnot. like, you were just saying, right, it has just enriched the whole TTRPG space.
Mhm.
And I am very grateful for that. And I have worked to do my very small part in encouraging that, and will continue to do so, because I think it's really important, and not even just in creator space, but just in players, right?
I agree.
Getting people who always would have loved to get into role playing, but weren't able or didn't think it was for them or whatever,
Right.
and bringing those people in, has made everything better.
I had Greg Tito on my show not too long ago, and he had said something that really stuck with me that fits in line with this. Is that it's just like the way your role play party is enriched by variation and different roles, so is your table.
That's a really good observation. That's great.
So while I've got you on here, my friends and I have had this very long, like 20-year long debate over this best stat generation method for characters. And so I like to rope people into that debate and just get their opinions on it. So would you mind sharing your preferred method of stat generation for your own characters or PCs and games that you run?
I kind of am of two minds, because I started playing D&D in 1977, and so I have some nostalgia for just picking up some six-siders
Yeah.
and rolling your stats and seeing what you get. And it's that same kind of thing that you get, I don't know, when you like play a card game or even like a solitaire game, right? You just
Mm,
kind of want to see what comes up this time, right? And
right.
that's sort of fun. And then building a character around that. Oh, I've only got a 6 charisma or whatever. Well, what does that mean?
Yep.
But I also recognize that that level of randomization is sometimes really unwanted, right? Because
Right.
you want to play the character that you want to play. And
Right.
so for that, the what we called the standard array, back for third edition, where you've just got 6 scores that you can then assign however you want.
Hmm.
That's probably my favorite way.
Yep.
If I was just going to sit down and run a game of D&D right now, it's probably along the lines of what I would suggest, just so that it allows people to have the say over what their character can do and what their character's good at.
Well, and it definitely fosters an equitable table. Everybody has sort of the same thing that they begin with. I mean, I'm sort of a roll of the dice purist. I love to hear the dice clatter on the table, and I like the randomization of what happens. But over the years, I mean, I've had exceptional games in both methods. So really, I think more we continue this debate, just because we're kind of curmudgeons to our own opinions sometimes, even though we've had games that are great both ways.
you know,
So
back in the
let me
day,
ask you one. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, back in the day, I played the fighter that I randomly rolled with an 18 strength and like a 4 intelligence, and I had a ball, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I do like about the die rolling method is the fact that you end up with stats that are sometimes way lower than you would be expecting to play with. So you have to learn how to represent those weaknesses and sort of compensate for that with your other strengths. And sometimes when you're middle of the road, and I don't think you see that same level of creativity, which I think is another thing I like.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that.
So let me ask you one more question. It's sort of a personal question about a adventure that I've been developing, which is basically a story of falling from grace, where all the characters start as one alignment and eventually fall from grace, becoming evil characters through a random series of ethical dilemmas that there is no good answer.
Cool.
The thing that I struggle with along this is the concept of how do I develop an alignment shifting system? Have you done that in any of your building before? Or is there anything that you know of out there that would suffice to like track how alignment changes over time?
The only thing that I've really dealt with in something like that was something in the very early stages when we were working on third edition. I started kind of playing around with this idea that, what if, in addition to your alignment, your alignment was rated, right? And
Mm,
so you could be, lawful good 10, right, which meant you were
yeah.
like crazy lawful good, or you could be like lawful good 2, right? Which is
Right.
like, yeah, I believe in this in that kind of outlook, but I'm not gonna put someone to death because of it, right?
Right.
I'm not gonna push it to some incredible extreme. And the reason that I kind of liked that was because that number would always be probably shifting, and it would be up to the
Yeah.
player. I'm feeling a little more, good now because we've been helping people, and that's made me feel really great, and we saved the village or whatever. So I'm going to increase that, from the 2 to a 4 or whatever. I liked that. I haven't ever really played around with the idea of changing alignment that wasn't just sort of ad hoc, right?
Right.
Where like someone just said, it says get a good on my sheet, but I'm really more neutral.
Well, and I think that's kind of what we tend to find players doing anyways, is they'll start the game with an alignment on their sheet, but then as they learn what the character really is through play,
For sure.
that really can kind of be, not even related at all.
Yeah, it almost seems like, and I'm one of those people that struggles with alignment in
Hmm.
general, and I hate to see it as a straitjacket. I like
Right.
to see it more as a guiding tool, but it almost seems wrong to even have an alignment before you've actually played the character,
I agree with that
right?
because there is so much about learning who your character is when you first start to play.
Right.
I don't always know what the personality is going to be until I'm faced with sort of the character decisions that are put in front of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I have long, in whatever game that I'm playing, I've long had not a rule, but a sort of outlook that, like, after the first session or even the first couple of sessions, if there's something that you want to change about your character because you made the wrong decision in character creation,
Mm,
I'm almost certainly going to allow it.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, especially if you're gonna play a long term campaign that's going to last a year and a half or whatever,
Hmm.
and you're stuck with some dumb decision that you made a long time ago. That's not fun.
That's very true. And it is an interesting time and place to kind of be trying to write this adventure when there is so much of the community that's moving away from the idea of alignments anyways. So I kind of thought, well, maybe the best way to do it wouldn't even be to have alignments in there, but just still have the same series of choices that eventually you're just kind of stuck in that, well, I've done a lot of bad things because of the choices I've been forced to make. And it could be more organic and doesn't really need to have anything numerical attached to it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view because, again, to kind of talk about that whole straitjacket thing, sometimes a player, when you give them sort of an ethical dilemma in the game, they'll look down at their character sheet, right, and they'll see lawful neutral or whatever, and they will feel like, okay, well, I don't have a choice. I have to
Right.
do what a lawful neutral person would do, and it sounds very much like what you want is for them to have to make
It,
that choice on their
yeah.
own and then kind of deal with the consequences. And you're going to feel more like the choice is your own rather than the game forcing you to make a certain choice.
That is awesome. Let me move on to something different, which is a question about. I mean, you've published so much and you've put so much out in the world. There, I know early on you wrote a setting you were going to do a Marvel thing that the rights kind of fell through and that never got published. But other than that, is there anything that you've created or that you have yet to publish that you're really super proud of and hope to see on the market someday?
It probably won't surprise you. I'm working on a couple of things now that are not yet published and are still very much in what I refer to as sort of the alpha stage, which is not even like something that is fully playable, but that I'm very excited about. One kind of has to do with dreams and consciousness, and what happens to your consciousness if you die, what makes us conscious beings, and that kind of thing it's always been a real interest to me. So that's one thing, and another is a science fiction but super far future, super advanced. I'm a big fan of reading nonfiction about technological advances and things that could possibly happen that just seem crazy over the top but
Yeah.
could really be possible in as we understand science. And it's not going to look like Star Wars, right? It's going
Right.
to look very different. but maybe really cool. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about and excited about right now. And yeah, I've always got a couple of things that are sort of down the road, and I'm excited about what's happening now and what we're putting out now, but I'm also excited about what I'm going to be doing 2 years from now.
I think that is kind of part of being a creator, right? Like the new thing always ignites that passion, reignites that passion in you. There's just something about the beginning of a project that's just so exciting and so exhilarating.
That is so true. Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to tricks of the trade. So for tricks of the trade today, I'm just going to ask Monte to share with us one or two ideas on how you, my listeners, can start the process of creating your own world or creating your own setting for your tabletop games. I also came with one of my own. I'll go ahead and go first. So Monte, you have a moment to think about it there. And I think one thing that's always really helped me come up with new ideas is whenever I'm consuming media of any fashion, I always keep a notepad or something nearby. And if there's a cool scene or if there's a cool idea, just jot it down, because something even small, like I think like the Chronicles of Riddick, I thought about the world in there and the way that the government was set up in that. And I took just that little piece out of that story and it made a really fantastic conceptual government for one of the worlds that I ran. But I always have that list of things to refer back to as I'm creating something new. And I think, oh, what's this going to look like? Oh, here's my whole list of ideas that I've got. Maybe I'll input this from that media source and then make this sort of Frankenstein monster of what ends up being really cool when it comes together.
I think that is really smart. That's really great advice. It's certainly something that I do. As I look around my office, I literally have 4 different whiteboards and a desk covered with little pieces of paper and journals and whatnot that are just filled with ideas that I've had while I've been doing something else or whatever, and jotted down. And I think that that's great. But another thing that you can do if you're trying to think of a whole new setting or world or game or whatever, sometimes you'll just kind of get this image or you'll see in a movie or something a scene and you're like, that's so cool, that's what I want. And if you can just kind of hyper focus on that thing and break it down and think, okay, what are the things when I watched that movie and I saw that scene where these guys were fighting this monster and these were the stakes and they had these abilities or whatever. And you break that down and you think about, okay, so what do I really love about that? Well, I really love that one ability that character had. And I really like the monster was such and such. And you break those down into those little bits and you're like, okay, so now what do I have to do to create a setting or world or whatever and that enables that to happen, right? And you take those, maybe it's just like 3 aspects and you're like, okay, so clearly in this world, some guy was using some cool magical power, right? Clearly that magical power exists and people have it, and that's like a profession that you can take or a skill that you can learn or a talent you're born with or whatever. And you just extrapolate up, right? And suddenly the world is starting to take form around that sort of core idea, that core scene that you had. I mean, that's absolutely how I started with Numenera, for example. I had like this one image in my head of like these people walking through this giant machine and they didn't know what it actually did or how it worked or anything because they were much less sophisticated than whoever had built it. And from that came a whole setting, and I think that that's really valuable, and it's particularly honing that skill of not just thinking about oh, that was a cool scene in that movie or in that book or whatever, but like, what about it did I really love? What are the key elements? Because then you'll make sure that you get to replicate that in the game that you want to run.
Breaking it down to its foundation so that you can rebuild it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Awesome. So before we sign off, let me give you the opportunity to share with my cyclothids where they can connect with you or buy your products, anything new you have in the works that you want to plug right now or anything else you would like to share.
go to montecookgames.com and you will find all kinds of articles and products and whatnot. I also want to talk about or mention I have kind of a blog, kind of a newsletter kind of thing on Substack. So what you want to do is it's called RPG Design Theories, and it's just montecook.substack.com. And
Awesome.
there I talk about all kinds of game design issues. People tell me that it's really useful just for GMs and DMs to read, but I come at it from the point of view of a designer and like why a designer does a certain thing, or why, a thing that a designer should be thinking about as they're developing rules or settings or whatever. So a lot about like what we've been talking about today.
Well, I'll make sure the links for all of that information gets in the show notes, Cyclothed, so you can find that and get to those sites. Monte, I just thank you so much for coming on the show today. I super appreciate this. It's sort of like a dream come true. I kind of had imposter syndrome today when you were coming on. I was like, I don't know if I'm ready for this interview, but you were fantastic to talk with, and it's really been fun.
I have had a great time and thought it was a great discussion about all kinds of things. So it's great.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was a lot of fun. I am so thankful to Mr. Monte Cook for being here on the show and sharing all of that great information with us. But now it's time for our new segment, Knowledge Check. Welcome to Knowledge Check. This is a new segment that I have started for Season 2. And in this segment, we're going to be summarizing literature or available data that applies to the topic of the week. So this could be psychological research surrounding the topics. It could be books that have been written on the topic. It might even be opinion pieces or blog posts that can be found online. But for today, I want to go back to a title released in September of 2000, and that is the Dungeon Master's Guide for the 3rd edition release of D&D, which was written by our guest today, Monte Cook, along with Jonathan Tweet and Skip Williams. In this core rulebook, there is a fantastic little section that starts on page 153, and it does a deep dive on world building, and I wanted to highlight some of the great advice that is given in that section. So the first thing that this section suggests that a game master would decide upon when starting their world building process is to decide which approach they're going to take. And they suggest one of two approaches, the inside-out approach or the outside-in approach. With the inside-out approach, you would start with a small area and build from there. You don't even have to think about what the world looks like. You don't have to think about what exists outside of the starting place that your characters are going to be placed in. As your story evolves and your characters explore more of the world, you will continue to build from that initial inside point further out as they explore more and more parts of your world and their knowledge about the surrounding areas and the world as a greater piece expands. The other approach, the outside-in approach, is exactly the opposite. You're going to start with the big picture. You might start by making a map of what your entire world or your continent that your characters are starting on looks like. You have a very good idea of everything that the characters might encounter on a broad spectrum throughout the world. You know the politics, the other kingdoms, the major political factions that they might encounter, what big groups exist. So this way takes a lot more work before starting the game, but you do start with a lot more detail. Once you have decided on your building approach and you have taken the time to get either where you're started or the bigger picture of what your world looks like, there's a lot of things you want to consider, things that go into that, like geography, demographics, the economics of your world. And within those things, you can break them down. For example, when you're thinking about geography, you want to not just think about the climate and the terrain, but you also want to think about the ecology of the world. What lives there? What exists under the land even? What sort of terrain types are more suited to what types of creatures that might be there? Are there any notable big monsters that live in a certain area of the world? With economics, you could think about things like what sort of coins will the party be using? Is it a traditional copper, silver, gold system, or is there something unique? Do you have the old early edition D&D Electrum, which was sort of a mixture between silver and gold, and it claimed that middle space between the two denominations? Are there taxes that the players would have to use, or would they have to deal with money changers if they go between one nation and another? So all of those types of things can play into your economics, as can, trade routes and trade goods and supply and demand. All very important things to consider, especially if you're building with that big picture and you want to know all of this stuff ahead of time. Think about politics. What are the political systems of your world? What is the makeup? I did a whole episode on politics for fantasy stories early on in season 1, so you might want to check that out. But think about, is it a monarchy? Is it tribal? Are certain areas of the world run by a republic or a magocracy or a theocracy? And there's so many other types. I mean, you can break it down even further. Is power passed from father to son or mother to daughter? Is there some sort of selection process that the monarch has to choose his successor? All of those kind of things can add a lot of immersiveness to your stories. As you break things down smaller, think of cultural tendencies. What sort of beliefs do certain areas have, or what sort of species live there? Is it a mix of all of the main species, or do you have more humans in one area, more dwarves and elves in another? How does that all play out in the area, especially the area that your characters are going to be starting in? Think about the legal system and the legal issues that the characters might face. Are there any unique laws or any unique crimes that they might need to know about? What are the social classes? Is it based on like European feudalism, or are you looking more at like feudal Japan? What sort of system do you want your characters to exist within? And what sort of systems exist in the nations or the kingdoms surrounding the area that they are starting in? Then look at very important historical things like, have there been major wars or calamities? Is there one going on right now that your players might have to contend with? Are certain nations hostile towards other nations around them or in other parts of the world? Consider the effect that religion is going to play into your campaign or your story. Is it like early Faerun, where the gods had a pretty powerful hand in the normal day-to-day lives of the people who lived in the world? Or is it more offset with the gods in the background, where religion is more of like it is in our world, where we don't really have any answers one way or another? So many things are speculation between which religion is the right religion. Or is it something that is just known? The gods are there, their power is real, we've seen it, we have proof, so that there's less mysticism around that sort of thing, and maybe more mysticism around strange forms of arcana or lichdom or undeath, or some of those sort of like culty type followings. And then finally, a really big one to consider is, how does magic and technology work in your world? Is it high fantasy magic where it's pretty common? Is magic very rare and sparse? Are there high levels of technology that might not be understood, like Monte spoke about today in his world, where technology is considered to be magic because it's not understood by the people who are using it, so it becomes more of a magical effect than a understandable piece of science? And then whenever I'm building a world with magic, I always have to ask myself, what restrictions are there placed on those who can use magic? Is it something that's limited to a certain cast of people, or is it something that there are very strict laws about? Can charms and compulsions be used, for example? Are they considered evil? What about necromancy or anything that has the evil descriptor? What sort of rules would your world have about magic, and how would those affect your characters playing in that world? So that is it for today, Cyclothids. Thank you so much for joining me. I do want to remind you to please get on Apple, get on Spotify, leave us a review. Those reviews really help in getting more listeners to the show and being able to keep doing what we're doing here. Also, you can follow me on Instagram. If you have not visited me there, please give me a follow. I almost always follow back. And if I don't, send me a DM and remind me to. But the Instagram is at dungeons_dragons_psychology. We've got a great season planned out for you this year, and I'm really excited about some of the other guests that we have coming up over the next few months. So stay tuned for that and stay up to date by following me on Instagram. And until next time, we'll see you next session.